Today, we'd like to talk about the gig economy. Going to talk about why we think at Bright Idea that this is a huge opportunity for all of you as our customers. And we're going to give you a little bit of best practices and some brief stories on other customers who have pioneered this journey to help you get started. Before I talk about the gig economy, I'd like to tell a little story. You heard Matt talk about the golden age of innovation. I'd like to talk about the golden age of horses and the horse economy. So there's this great book by this author, Nick Bostrom. I don't know if anybody's familiar, but he is probably one of the most preeminent artificial intelligence researchers. And he's written a book called Superintelligence. And the premise of the book is actually what will happen to humanity, to labor, with this exponential growth of artificial intelligence. And so he tells this story about horses. You go back just about 100 years to the 1920s. There were actually 26 million horses in the United States. This is actually a time when the United States only had about 100 million population, so one horse for every family pretty much. And horses were pervasive across all kinds of labor, plowing the fields, transportation obviously. Actually, this is a picture of New York City in the 1920s. Those horses are hauling some snow instead of having the big snow plows that we have today. We actually hired some of these horses last night to haul some of you back from the 20s party. So he talks about these horses, and he says it's such a pervasive thing in the economy, and yet, starting in the late 1800s, we had this advent of the combustion engine. And you saw yesterday these big kind of technological trends that Matt was talking about. Well, it actually took decades for the combustion engine to permeate through the economy, but by the 1950s, the population of horses was actually down to 2 million. So 10% of the original population of horses. Sad to think what happened to all the horses, but really the moral of the story here is that technology has a really pervasive effect on how labor is accomplished in society. And Nick Bostrom's book is about artificial intelligence, so he's really talking about the future of AI and what type of impact that's going to have on us. I think the verdict is not out yet on that, but what we can say is that things are really going to change quite dramatically. If you take a look at this slide here, on the left-hand side is actually one of our client companies that you saw yesterday, GM, General Motors. And that's a auto manufacturing plant from about the 1940s, I would guess, from the style of the cars. And on the right-hand side, obviously a much more modern manufacturing plant. And so I think we can ask the question, what's happened to all these people who are on the assembly line? And there's no doubt that those jobs have been kind of taken out of the labor force, but really what we're talking about is those people now have a lot more time on their hands, right? They're not doing the laborious kind of day-to-day tasks. And we hope that technology in general is going to have this type of trend. You saw obviously GM doing quite well. Those guys are lifting the company up into its next evolution. So we think this is a really big opportunity for everybody because it's something that's coming, and we want you to be prepared for it. And so I just want to talk about this term, the gig economy, for a little bit, and kind of define it and put some guardrails around it. So gigs are not new. Everybody's been doing gigs your whole life. Throughout history, gigs, you could typically define it as a short-term job, service provider, and the person who needs the service kind of connecting directly, right? And so gigs are definitely something that you all have experienced, but the difference here really, and what defines the gig economy are the technological platforms that are bringing these things together and enabling gig at scale, right? And that's the gig economy. And so this is nothing new to everyone. How many folks have used Uber maybe in the last couple of days? Raise your hands, please. Yeah. How about Upwork? Has anybody ever used Upwork? Okay, a little bit less. Airbnb? Right, right. So everybody knows these platforms very well, and you're pretty acclimated to this notion of the gig economy, but perhaps you may not be aware how pervasive it actually is. Some studies by Manpower Group over the past year or two actually came to find that 36% of the workforce is actually freelancing in the United States. So over a third. And there's a nuance to that statistic, which is, some people do it not by choice, but when you look into the numbers, actually, a significant majority are choosing to do freelancing. And beyond that, those research studies also indicated that most people in the world are actually open to doing freelancing. And beyond that, over half of the freelancers, this is in the United States again, are under the age of 30. So I think if you look at that from this kind of mountaintop view, you can clearly see that this is a pretty big sea change in the way that labor is being facilitated, certainly in the United States, if not around the world. And so, you don't need to take my word for it. I think the statistics kind of speak for themselves. I want to talk a little bit about bringing gig into your enterprise. So this, I think, is where people get a little bit less familiar with the gig economy. Certainly these external platforms, these consumer-facing platforms are something that everybody is familiar with. But we want to talk about why bringing gig economy into your organizations and leveraging your workforce is actually going to serve a great purpose and be a huge opportunity for you guys. So the first thing, why would you do this in the first place? So some perhaps daunting statistics here. Almost half of your employees waste up to an hour a day, okay? And if you're, depending on whether they're salaried or part-time, you can see almost 10% of your employees are actually wasting up to 10% of their, almost 10% of your employees are wasting up to 3 hours a day, okay? So these are statistics, by the way, from Paychex. So Paychex is the company that does a lot of your payroll, so they have this data on hand. And so you take a company, maybe I shouldn't name names, but you take a company like General Electric, 300,000 employees. What does it mean for 10% of their workforce to waste up to 3 hours a day? Can you imagine the amount of loss in productivity? That's a really significant statistic. And this, by the way, is not just people going on Facebook and wasting their time. When you look into why people waste their time, the biggest reason was lack of work. They don't have enough to do. Easily distracted, not satisfied with work, no incentive to work harder due to a boss or coworker. This is why people waste their time. And this is something that we think the gig economy in general can really take care of all of these reasons. And then in addition to that, we have some data that would indicate that simply by connecting your employees, productivity can increase up to 25%. In addition, when employees are exercising their strengths, their skill sets, and you'll see today some of these stories here are really about empowering your employees and allowing them to use their skills, things that they're good at that they may not get to exercise. But when you allow them to do that, you get an 8% productivity improvement, and engagement increases over 6 times. So it's almost as if there's a missing piece of the puzzle that we just need to put in, and gig economy will be well on its way. So I want to talk a little bit now about how you can get started, and I want to start by doing a little bit of stories from the pioneers, so the people who have been doing this. So Bright Idea has taken about almost a year now, and we've worked with a handful of select clients. I just want to point out, actually, Will, who's in the room, Calvin, who's in the room. You guys, GM and Nike respectively, you contributed to our research. We really, really appreciate it. And And actually, so let's get started with some of these stories. I also want to remind you that this is something, if you look at our corporate innovation journey, you guys saw Matt talk about this yesterday. So this is actually something that falls within the transformation portion of our innovation journey. And if you listen carefully yesterday, you know, this is somewhat prescriptive. It's you know, a sequential thing. And that's because the activities that are being done up in this top right quadrant are really difficult and require, you know, a lot of knowledge and expertise. So when we talk about transformation, we're really talking about permeating new technologies inside the company. So you could talk about artificial intelligence transformation. Google Brain is an organization that was set up to permeate artificial intelligence throughout Google. You could refer back to our presentation from Josh Mook last year at General Electric. You might call that additive manufacturing transformation, right? And so now when we're talking about gig, we're really talking about almost like labor transformation throughout the company. So I want to actually tell Calvin's story first. So Calvin works at Nike, and he told me this story about this program that they have called MicroStretch. And so Calvin and Bright Idea hooked up maybe a year or two ago. We were supporting him with kind of more of strategic activities outside of the gig economy. And of course, Nike being a company with thousands and thousands of employees, lots of ideas coming into the Bright Idea system. One of the ideas that came through was about this thing called stretch assignments. So stretch assignments were basically like a 20% time at Google is something that people are probably familiar with. You can do things that are outside of your immediate tasks or mandate so long as you get some kind of approval. And these are things that you work on outside of your day job, right? Well, the idea that came into Bright Idea was actually about the problems with stretch assignments. So for one, stretch assignments were hard to find. You had to go find a guy who knew a guy who had some of these stretch assignments available to you. And so they weren't discoverable. And in addition, people didn't really have a lot of time to work on these stretch assignments. They tended to be pretty meaty projects that were tough to wrangle outside of your day job. And so the idea came in, and Calvin and his team thought to do this program called MicroStretch. And MicroStretch was basically what we're talking about here. It's a form of gig economy inside your company, but Calvin said, let's do this online. Let's put it somewhere digital where it's discoverable. People can post jobs. People can volunteer for those jobs. And let's also play a little bit with this idea of duration of the job, right? Because we're finding that people are maybe complaining about the stretch assignments duration. And so they came up with these smaller assignments, and they put a set of guidelines up for volunteering and for posting jobs. And so MicroStretch was born. And today, MicroStretch is deployed in their headquarters and quite successful. Calvin, you got any thoughts or statistics? I don't want to put you on the spot, but can you just say what has come of this so far? Yep. Yeah, so Calvin's been one of the early pioneers. Thank you for that, Calvin. And so successful so far, and actually going to be expanding in the coming year. Is that correct? Yep. So I'll move on through a few of these stories, and then I'll kind of refer back to them. The next one I want to tell you about is Unum. So For those who may not be familiar, Unum is actually a Fortune 500 company, and they deal in the insurance industry. This is an interesting one. You know, the CIO at Unum decided a few years ago that these things like Uber, Upwork, and so on and so forth were going to be so pervasive that they wanted to get ahead of this as quickly as possible. And so they started a program called the IT Talent Hub. So this is contained kind of within the constraints of IT itself. And so they launched this program within IT, and it turns out that there were actually so many volunteers, but not enough projects, right? So you'd think that it would be just the reverse, but it turns out that there's an abundance of volunteers. This is actually one of the lessons that they learned. But nevertheless, they deemed it a success. Just to give you some quick stats here. So 80% of their IT staff, which is between 1,000 and 2,000 people, are on this IT Talent Hub. And they've actually completed about 45 projects over the past year or so. So again, pretty successful. And then also, this is Maureen Bellinger. She's not able to be here, but she had mentioned that, you know, this has had so much success in IT and people see it across the organization that they're actually starting to adopt it in HR and other parts of the company as well. So the next story is Black & Veatch. Again, for those who aren't familiar, Black & Veatch is actually a global infrastructure construction company. So roads, highways, so on and so forth. So this is actually a really interesting story because now you can start to see the quantifiable impact. So in this case as well, the CEO this time of Black & Veatch saw Uber and Upwork and all these things, and they too wanted to get on the train. And so they started this thing called Next Stops. And this is something that it's pretty small scale, but it's actually company-wide. It's available to the entire company. And Ryan here, who's the VP of Innovation and Strategy, he told me a story about a prospective client that they got who wanted their help imagining the future of infrastructure when autonomous vehicles come through, right? So what does that mean for an infrastructure construction company? How do we build highways differently? How do we build bridges differently? How do we build energy infrastructure to support these autonomous vehicles and so on and so forth? Well, guess what? Black & Veatch is not a company that knows much about autonomous vehicles. They did not have the expertise inside of their company. And so this prospective customer had asked basically for a bid for some work, and they used Next Stops to reach out to the company to ask and see if there's anybody who has autonomous expertise. And lo and behold, they actually found people across the company that in one sliver, there was some marketing expertise, some folks who could do some concept designs. In another sliver, there were some technological people who understood the concepts behind AI and so on and so forth. And so they put together a proposal using Next Stops. And you can see here, they actually ended up winning a multi-million-dollar contract. No expertise whatsoever in the industry, right? So that's the impact. That's the impact that we can have. One last story, and again, want to highlight the great work at General Motors. Did everybody love that presentation yesterday? Fantastic, right? So those guys are doing really excited things. I actually I requested to work on that project when General Motors came into Bright Idea because I was so excited by the things that they were doing. They really do. I mean, you saw it yesterday. They kind of own innovation across the company to some degree. They have their hands in everything. They only talked about, by the way, a fraction of what they're doing yesterday. So really exciting things moving forward. But I did have a chance to talk with Steven Anderson, who runs this sort of pseudo gig economy inside of General Motors. And so the team that talked yesterday, they have this thing called Studio Y. That's what Bright Idea would refer to as sort of an innovation lab where you can do things like prototyping and so on and so forth. And GM, being an auto manufacturer, there's a lot of really talented engineers across the company. And for a variety of reasons, a lot of these talented engineers have time on their hands and they're not being utilized as well as the folks at the iHub would like them to be. And so they spun up this sort of gig economy activity called Additive Design Connect. So additive meaning, kind of 3D printing, and the notion was we have a deficiency on either side. So folks who know how to do CAD design may not have the need in front of them. They may not have a reason to engineer CAD design, or they may not have the tools even to print the designs if they do have the need. And then on the other side, those who have the need certainly don't have the expertise all the time. And so they spun up this program called Additive Design Connect. This was on Bright Idea. And they started to solicit for 3D printing projects. So you need a CAD model for X? Sure, we can go and find you the experts. That's another thing that they do really well. They reach across the company and they pull in the resources that they need. They talked about team building, right? That's the type of thing, and I'll talk about in the best practices, where hunting out for the right people, kind of matching up and finding the right skills is essential. But so they told me this story about Design Connect around these things called design aids. And I didn't know what a design aid was up until them sharing this story. But apparently a design aid is actually a small custom tool that's typically used, when you're making a new vehicle, you're prototyping pieces, you may need to measure a component that has never been made before, and so there is no tool to measure it, right? And so what they do with these design aids is they'll outsource manufacturing of them, and they need to work for months to put together the logistics, the paperwork, and so on and so forth to get these things contracted to buy them from their vendors. And so what they were able to do actually is for these design aids, through Additive Design Connect, they say now, today we need something, a measurement tool, let's say, and they were able to bring down the cost of this from literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to on some of these parts down to pennies. And that's the power, obviously, of additive manufacturing, but that's also the power of being able to connect the need with the right skill set at the right time. In addition, I mentioned it takes months to get these parts out the door. They're able to do it now in hours. Right? So in my opinion, very impressive, very successful things going on. They're also starting to expand this concept of gig economy. We did a lot of research with the guys at General Motors. They were one of the top contributors actually to all the research that we did for our gig app that you guys saw yesterday. Right? So how do we get started with this? I hope that you guys are all kind of excited about what you heard here and the stories and the power that this can bring inside of your organization. It's actually quite amazing when you think about it. Reducing costs by 10x and connecting people across the company and so forth. So I want to give you a few quick tips, and I'll refer back to some of those stories and just try to give you a sense of how you can get started. The first thing I want to talk about is detractors. So I'm not going to assume anything about the folks in the room, but certainly within your companies, you're going to have people who will say, not here. We're not going to do this here. It's not going to work. We have a different kind of company, right? That's always the phrase, we're different in some way. But what I actually found is that this type of program in all my research, so I reached out to maybe 10 or 20 customers who have kind of either dived into this already full steam or are interested in getting started. Turns out that friction isn't really there, right? It's not really there. It's something perhaps kind of from the past that people hold on to. But everybody who I talked to were able actually to get these programs out quite quickly, quite effectively, scale them up, and are driving a lot of success. So I think you can do that too. So the first step here is establish alliances. So if you notice, I didn't kind of call it out directly, but in the Nike slide here, I mentioned that Calvin had told me that his partnerships with HR and IT and just generally across the organization were actually the biggest contributing factor to their success. What I also didn't tell you is that MicroStretch is on Bright Idea, but that's MicroStretch 2.0. The first version of MicroStretch was actually a homegrown version. So Calvin had, as they had this idea, they decided to build it internally. And with their own resources, kind of without the help of others, lo and behold, several months later, they had some learnings, but really the thing kind of fizzled out. And so as they prepared for 2.0, they went out, they formed their alliances, HR obviously a big one, IT obviously a big one, and you unblock yourself. you unblock yourself, because these people will empower you. Again, don't be afraid to ask HR, say that you're going to get in trouble or what have you. These people will unblock you. And if there is any friction there, you can call it a pilot, and that should get you done. All right, so the next thing is finding a home. And so I want to talk about this in two ways. So where does this thing need to live, both from an ownership and governance perspective, but also from an implementation perspective? Where do these jobs need to come from? Where do these volunteers need to come from? So it's interesting, actually, transformational activities, you typically want them to sit at the top of the corporation, right, so that you can permeate those technologies, those practices throughout the organization. But we found in those stories and in my research that these things are growing in different parts of the organization. So the first thing that I would say is, if you're just getting started, there's nothing wrong with starting where you're at in your department, in your locale, with your teams that you have adjacent to you. Ultimately, probably these things will be a corporate function. But the other thing is also, where does the implementation need to live? So you may own it out of your department, but where do the jobs need to come from? Where do the volunteers need to come from, and so forth? And I would say that, going back to the Unum example, and that was consistent in all my research, a lot more volunteers than there are jobs. Would you guys say, Calvin and Will, would you say that that's the case for you? Sure. Okay, well, that's good. But so you have the right balance, and I think that means that you've basically found the right home for it, right? And so, but to the point, if you go back to the Unum example, a lot more volunteers than there are jobs. So I think when we're looking for a home, we want to find where the largest need is. And this, going now back to the General Motors example, I think they did a good job of this as well, because as an engineering company, you have people all across the company who have these great ideas but don't have the skills and don't have the tools to access bringing their ideas to fruition, right? So find a home, find the right place where you can have the jobs that are going to be fulfilled by other people in the company, right? So the other thing is gathering skills. So whether you use the Bright Idea Gig app or not, a really key component is this notion of skills matching, right? Gig economy is a matching problem. You need to find people who have the need, and you need to find people who have the skill set, and you need to put those things together, and this is where the technology platforms come in. But I can't overemphasize how important this is. Interesting story, I'm not going to tell you who told me this, but they started this kind of gig economy technology here, and they went out to their HR team and they said, well, can you tell us, people's skill sets, their functions, and so on and so forth, so that we can do this matching game? And HR said, we don't know what people's skills are. And think about it, a lot of you are pretty tech savvy, right? You've all dealt with kind of like HR directories and stuff like that, the data that you have on your people. How often are skills and expertise, personal interests, so on and so forth, actually stored in these databases? I would say almost never, right? And so Bright Idea, you actually saw in some of the features yesterday, we're going to give you some tools to inventory your company's skills. We're going to prompt users to put in their expertise into the platform. And this is going to play a huge part in the matching game. And I can't underemphasize this as well. You need to gather the skills and make a database of skills in order for this to work, because that's how you match up, right? Okay, so stay lean and build for scale. So this is one that we can probably go through quickly, because you guys, being innovation practitioners, you understand this concept very well. This is not something, as far as my research goes, that you need to boil the ocean around. You don't need to kind of, try and get the entire enterprise on board. You can start small. And building for scale, what does that mean? So another interesting insight that I found in my research is that these things can't be managed at scale. You cannot manage a company of 200,000 people posting jobs, volunteering for jobs, and be able to facilitate and coordinate those things from a centralized team. So what you need to do is have a system in place, both technological and procedural, to be able to scale up with very minimal resources. And I actually found this pretty interesting also. You know, almost always when people come to Bright Idea and they say, we want to do crowdsourcing, a lot of times they're looking for kind of an easy button, right? They want to put the system out there and they say, okay, let's let it be self-managed. Almost always does that not work. But I think the reason is because people don't have necessarily the incentive. If you're just crowdsourcing ideas, they don't have the incentive to go above and beyond to submit those ideas. And then obviously you need to bring ideas through to fruition, so somebody needs to manage that funnel. But if you think about the way that gig works, it is self-managed. People do have incentive. One of the things that we heard over and over and over again is that this is not just about productivity. This is about empowering people, getting them to feel good about their job again. I actually didn't mention it, but the gentleman from General Motors who we spoke to, who runs their Design Connect, the genesis of that was him feeling, disenchanted with his job. The things that he was working on, the monotony of it, and that's where Design Connect came from. So building for scale, I think, means putting a framework in place of procedures and technology that will allow this thing to scale up and be self-managed. Certainly you might have a couple of people poking in there, making sure the projects are moving along and so forth, but it's not something that you need to manage on a case-by-case basis, and I think that's pretty insightful because it's a little bit counterintuitive. Okay? And that leads me to the last point, which is the governance model. So Calvin has actually done a phenomenal job about this. So while we're not going to have people managing the day-to-day of all of these projects, if you put the right framework in place, you'll find that people kind of do things the right way themselves, and that's not always the case. But if you look at MicroStretch, what they actually did was they put a set of guidelines and procedures. And so if you want to post a MicroStretch job, it has to be under 20 minutes. Sorry, that's not right. It's something like that. It has to be under a certain amount of time, and it has to be require a certain amount of resources. It has to be a certain duration of time. You have to have certain, perhaps approvals and so on and so forth before you can actually post to MicroStretch or volunteer in MicroStretch. And I think that's the magic, is kind of setting those guardrails and just letting the thing kind of take off by itself, right? And then the last thing I just want to mention is that we're here to help. So Sarah and Carlos, who are Bright Idea employees in the back of the room, they built the Gig app. And I myself, I consulted for 8 years in innovation management and your customer success managers and so on and so forth. We have an abundance of resources. We don't want you to feel like that you need to do this on your own. And we would look forward to kind of moving forward in this journey with you. If you have any questions whatsoever, we actually, at least from a product standpoint, we have the rocket scientists in the room over there. You're welcome to go after this meeting. And then again, please reach out to your customer success managers. And so I'm going to pause for questions now, but before I do that, I want to set the kind of guidelines for Q&A. So we actually have a couple of mic runners in the back of the room. And just so that everybody can hear your questions, so that we can have it on the recording, we ask that you raise your hand if you have any questions. But this is Gig Economy. We hope we're excited to start with us. Yeah.
Check.
Yep, there you go.
I just want to clarify a couple things.
Please.
So the Design Connect, first of all, thank you for the credit, because I had a bunch of people that worked really hard on this with
Absolutely.
Bright Idea. It was definitely a partnership, but this is a big one for us. Design Connect was really about manufacturing. They bought a bunch of printers. They couldn't do the CAD work. They were spending money outside. We had capability. They just couldn't connect them. So it was a classic case of there was pain on both sides.
Yep.
And that's what I would suggest people look for. The other aspect I would say is we went to HR. I don't know if you were using us as an example, but we did go to HR and talk about what we call passions and expertise. And they said, we would love to have that. We don't have that. And so you talk about, gathering or establishing alliances. They were in like instantly. And if you go to HR, you can create something that people will want to share their passions and expertise because they can ask for it. they will fall all over themselves to work with you. They'll throw money at you. They'll do whatever. And the last one is Steve was in a catch-22, and I don't think this is just GM. I think this is universal. So the managers that were controlling that CAD capability, you know, the work ebbs and flows. And they didn't want to reveal to their leadership, hey, I got guys sitting on their hands, because they knew when the rat and the snake got to them, you know, and they were going to have a ton of work, they'd be short of people. Got it? And so what they were doing was they were kind of hiding guys with Steve, and Steve was in the same building as us, and he literally just started to show up every day in our space and say, can I help you? Can I work with you? And so what happened was we went to the leadership of the business and talked to them about this, and we coached them not to go to their boss, their down levels people, and say, hey, is this happening? Are you doing this? But to be empathetic of it and everything. And what happened was the managers were relieved that they could reveal that they had this issue and that they could use this tool going forward. So right now, every party is on board. And so you talk about building alliances. If you can have that empathetic moment and not be pointing fingers, not have leadership pointing fingers, this becomes, I mean, literally, we have people beating our door down to get this implemented right now. And you'll have the same thing. And the employees, and I'll finish with this one, and I'm sorry to take over.
That's great. Thank you, Will.
The employees, the advantage they have is for so long they have not been able to manage their lives, right? They had to find somebody to be pulling on them, you know, to get to those opportunities. And what this does, and we love this part, it takes away that, and it makes it agnostic and democratic. If you've got something like with Black and Veatch, if you've got something that can transform the business, we will transform your life. We will transform your career through this capability. And that is probably the most exciting thing about what we're doing. And I'm sure Calvin would say the same thing, that people can show their passions and expertise, and they want to share it then. And then now you build this database, and then you get into that situation where it self-manages, and literally you just step aside and let the thing run.
Yeah. Thank you, Will.
So just a quick question on the data set. So we've been running our HR department's been running a gig economy for about 6 months. We're using the Hackathon app kind of on our own, but I'm excited to see the new product. Probably replace it with that. But our HR department's been really pushing for expertise. You know, we use Workday, like many big corporations. People just aren't submitting the expertise. And so I'm curious, one, is there an integration with Workday or something like that in the works so that we can have one single truth for the expertise of our employees? And two, the second question is kind of unrelated but similar, is from a skill set in terms of, not skill set, in terms of a project type for a gig, is there any guidance from the groups that are successful with this in terms of what types of projects make great gigs?
Sure. So on the first question with regard to the data set, at this point we're going to offer you tools to kind of en masse import attributes about your users in Bright Idea. But we do integrations as well. I was chatting with someone from PwC the first night of Synthesize, and he had brought up the exact same point, and he had said, why don't we pull from LinkedIn? I think those are really exciting opportunities. I think those are ones that we're going to likely explore. You saw the integration with Affinity. You saw the integration with Crunchbase. I think this is actually the time where Bright Idea is starting to bring in this external data. And certainly, I didn't mention, but I manage the technical services at Bright Idea, so if you wanted to have a chat, we can talk after this session, and we can talk about doing an integration with Workday or another application. Absolutely. Okay, good. I'm sorry, did you have was there another question in there?
Yeah,
sorry about
so one of the problems we've ran into with our HR group is they want to bring forward projects and get people to work on them, you know, as these kind of micro gigs or whatever. But they're bringing forward projects that suck.
Right. Okay, so the types of jobs, got it. Well, I'll not be the judge about that. But one thing I'll say is, you know, there's depth to skills, right? And that's obvious. But you know, if you're talking about addition and subtraction versus differential calculus, you know, and you need somebody who's very deep in a skill set in order to be able to do differential calculus, and they've had to do all the things that preceded that, right? So I think when you're looking for a home for this program, you should really consider where is the biggest need in terms of depth of skill set. So to me, and I don't want to be biased because I know people have a lot of different types of organizations, different proficiencies and so forth, but to me, you know, STEM type of activities are really where the depth of skills becomes critical. So anything to do with engineering, science, you know, technology, and so on and so forth, that tends to be where this is hitting the most successful. But Calvin and Will, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that?
As far as actually the type of projects, yeah, I mean, like, I definitely echo actually what you just said. You know, what you see on the external site, like, you know, TaskRabbits or Odesk and things like that, a lot of it like technical, something that has a very, very clear beginning and an end, those works great. But anything that has like sort of vague and is going to be sort of like what we call it chronic projects, definitely not a good one. But something that has a clear start and end, and also the visibility, right? Exposure, you know, from a talent standpoint, you know, you creating a site for a senior leadership, obviously that's going to be, you know, something that's going to draw a lot of folks. Yeah.
And I would just say what we're focused on is just really clear jobs. I would say like the CAD work is like, hey, create this model, then you're done. Because what the problem we've had with our group in general is we get married to people and we're very small, right? And so you do a little bit and they're like, great, now can you do this iteration? It's like, no, that was the job you asked us to do. We did that. And so it has to be super clear up front to be successful with it. So,
Yep. Thank you. Go ahead up front.
So
I think you're good. And then Joey, we
Okay.
had a question in the back also.
So yeah, this is Ryan from Black and Beach with the Next Ops example, and so we've been doing the gig economy. We started as experiment. This is about 2 years ago now. So probably have done about 200 opportunities projects through that. I would say a couple things in terms of skills. Generally, the tasks that we have people post, it ranges. I'll give you an example. So we had one with. I'm sure everybody in this room has something on AI and machine learning. So if you're familiar with AI and machine learning, there's a very rote part of that where you have to train a model. So we had a task that was literally, I had put out, I need people to look at 10,000 images and categorize them as A or B. And I was like, this is the most boring task in the world, right? And you can't believe how many people enthusiastically responded that, oh, I really want to do this. And like, okay. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we needed people with AI and machine learning capabilities, which I would say, like, our platform works really well when you don't have a department that does that, when you're looking for specialized expertise. But we had people who maybe did this in a prior job or in college and just have this latent talent that they really wanted to employ in the organization. So, you know, people with really high level skill in a certain thing that was sort of like a, you know, getting dole in the knife drawer, right? So two ends of the spectrum on the skills. And then in terms of skills, we were concerned about people, how do you identify skill sets? But the way we do it is essentially self-nomination. So I'll put out the task on match these pictures, and like literally anybody in the company can do it, right? And then the machine learning one, it's like, you know, depending on who responds. So we might have like 3 or 4 people respond to that opportunity based upon they actually have availability and they say they have the skill. So it's really, because a lot of these things are not in a normal database of skills or on their LinkedIn profile. Another example is like, we build infrastructure, but for one of our innovation projects, we were looking for landlords. So people, you know, nobody would put that they have a small time, like they own 3 rental properties on their work resume, right? So we had that, and then like, you know, 20 people responded in an hour that, hey, yeah, I'm a landlord and I can help you out in the focus group. So I would say, like, I wouldn't worry too much about integration with skill set, well, depending on how you're approaching it. But a lot of the stuff we do is like the skills are not on people's work resume, or they're not in their day-to-day job.
Yep. Yes, in the back.
Okay.
Got it.
So I was wondering if people are using external skills to supplement if the internal skills are not available. So are you doing stretch projects and then adding people from Upwork or other places to supplement, because you want to get the work done, especially like the further out stuff like Ryan, the multi-million-dollar project, if you didn't have the skills internally, would you have gone externally to supplement whoever you found internally? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so Carlos, can you bring the mic to Ryan?
So we have a separate actual external gig type thing we call our knowledge network for our own independent consultants, and then we will use like platforms like Upwork and the like. But I believe what needs to exist is like an API for tasks that allows things to easily move between these different platforms. So generally, one of the reasons we developed this is because we had a lot of people going outside for like a videographer or who knows what, right? Graphic design, and like there's actually a lot of people in the company that want to do that. So part of our use case was to help lower our outsourcing costs by taking advantage of the slack capacity in the company.
Yeah, and I think that's fairly consistent just in terms of that mix of internal and external. I think actually going external is probably the norm. And so now we're trying to supplement some of those needs internally. I have a question in the front here.
Thank you. I have a bit of an operational question for people who are doing this. We're actually looking at Bright Idea as a potential platform, so prospective customer. One of the things that we did as a proof of concept is we loaded in 224 ideas. Our company is not short on ideas. And if I'm attempting to use Gig to tap into the talent to do this, I don't know if your platform allows us, if I'm trying to manage 224 different ideas, and those ideas have subtasks or jobs. I may need a Java developer, I may need a back-end developer, whatever it may be. Can I link the gigs to a particular idea so that I don't lose track of, I'm putting out these gig requests, but they match to which of my ideas that I'm trying to push through?
Yeah, so the answer is yes. That's actually part of yesterday's release, is the ability to link these objects across the initiatives. So you may be doing a crowdsourcing challenge. You may get some idea out of that that ends up going into your incubator. And then from that, you spawn off these gigs in a gig initiative, and you can link them back to the project that's ongoing. But that's an interesting discussion. You know, there was actually a lot of debate as to what is the actual object that sits inside of Bright Idea. Is it the overarching project, or is it just like the short-term object, like this mini task, or is it the big project? So I think this linking capability is really the compromise, and it seems to be that folks are trying to make as tight a task as possible, and that's part of the success. You have to, and Will said it, and Calvin has echoed that, you have to really tightly define these projects in order for them to work successfully. So having inside the gig app the kind of small tasks and having those linked up to the larger projects, I think would be the way to go.
So I have a question around when people are submitting or signing up to help out with these ideas. Do you get a lot of people that may not have the expertise but are interested in gaining that expertise, and how do you handle that, knowing that they still have to learn it to be able to create what you're looking for? Or do you try to make sure they only have the expertise instead of trying to teach them since they're signing up for it?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll certainly let Ryan and Calvin speak to this as well, but just in my experience, it's going to be kind of a combination, right? You as the need haver, if you have a project that you need worked on, and just put yourself in a position of putting this on Upwork, you are really looking for somebody who's well qualified to fulfill the job. On the other hand, we know that this exercise is an exercise of growing your skill sets, and so I think it's really going to be a combination. Likely that a job poster, if they get a bunch of responses, you saw yesterday in the product presentation, just like Upwork, you're going to have a list of freelancers who have volunteered for your job. You're going to poke around in their profiles, see what they're good at, see what part of the company they come from, and so forth, and you're going to try and pick the person who's best qualified. But I think as long as you have a sufficient place to get started here where the need is really there, the rest is going to follow suit. And then as it grows and grows and grows, just like on Upwork, I mean, some of those people, you know, you take a chance on it because they're available, or you know, whatever it is, they don't cost much. Obviously, this is a different situation with the cost aspect, but so does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, please.
So I would say that as much as the goal is to get it to self-manage, in the beginning it's kind of hand-to-hand combat, and you will have people that have aspirations, right? They aspire to get to something, and you always need manpower, you know, in the second and third tier, and so you can leverage that, but it's not going to be done off the platform, you know, from an AI perspective, or you're going to have to manually do it. And it also, but this goes back to, like, we talk about being magnetic. This is about giving people the chance to reinvent themselves, right? And so if you have that, it kind of builds on itself, that groundswell buzz. And so the platform is great because it enables it, but you still have to manage it in the beginning to get it.
Yep. All right, excellent. So thank you, everyone, for joining. I think we're just about out of time here. If you wouldn't mind, we actually have the kind of rating system on the Synthesize app, so please take a look at the app and rate the session if you liked it. Again, appreciate your time, and have fun with the rest of the conference. Thank you.